Are we? We're good? All right? Okay. All right. All right, everybody. Today is part 3.1. We're talking about allergies and autoimmunity, insights and uncommon knowledge. I think this part is more dedicated to the behaviors. We talked a lot about the immune system and the underpinnings of the mechanisms, and today we're going to bring it to life. We're going to bring it to real life. We're going to bring it to your life. We're going to talk to it in different stages of life. All right, so today we are going to hit the wrap-up. Boom. So, almost 6 million children under the age of 18, that's 1 in 13 kids, have food allergies. That's a prevalence stating. That says how important this information is. 1 in 13 children have allergies. There are no current recommendations of specific interventions parents can take to definitively prevent allergies in their unborn child. Interesting how it says that. Prevent allergies in their unborn child. Yes, that is true. Allergens, allergenicity, the propensity to develop allergies starts before birth. So if you're a fetus right now, definitely take this into consideration. Or if you're pregnant or a woman looking to become pregnant, definitely super important. Okay, epigenetics. We're going to dive into this because this is probably one of my favorite things because it is behind the scenes in almost every disease, and it's an emerging field, and it's something that we have new tools to address and to enhance, to fix. We can make changes that prior to maybe a couple of years ago, definitely not more than, not 20 years ago, we have access to make changes and updates in the way that your body uses your DNA to control your health, and that's relevant in all diseases, specifically and prominently in allergy development. So we're going to talk about epigenetics. Buckle up. Epigenetic biomarkers are mitotically and or meiotically heritable but reversible. All right, so we need to focus right here. It says heritable but reversible. This means you can inherit them. They come from parents to children, but they are reversible. They are functional and biologically relevant biochemical modifications of the chromatin. All right, so biochemical modifications of the chromatin. The chromatin is the library part of your DNA. This is what informs your body as to what you can and cannot use for your libraries of building the proteins that are the building blocks of your body. If you don't have them, if they're not complete, if you don't use the ones that you do have, then you don't get to express the fullness of what people can do. Now, it's interesting because it seems simple that if you don't have access to certain parts of the library, that you will have poor health or diseases or suffering, and they could be in anything. It could be metabolic, it can be psychological, it can be muscle, it can be autoimmune, it can be any kind of disease. We're talking about in the context of allergens, but epigenetic changes to the chromatin basically make it so that you don't have access to that part of your genetic library. So you cannot respond to your environment, and then the response to your environment is diminished, so then your environment stresses you out, and eventually once you get stressed out enough, you die. Okay, so this literally is a mechanism that we can activate in your body to change the way that you respond to your environment, therefore how much health and wellness you can express. Okay, so, but look, the modifications to the chromatin, carrying the information, but not changing the sequence of the genome. So not changing the sequence, highlighted, underlined, bold, bold, bold. All right, so this doesn't remove books from your library. This just says you can't go to that section. So the cool thing about that is they're reversible, right here. And that's largely through biochemical interactions. That means we can use very specific targeted nutrition, we're going to cover that as we go, to change the way your DNA is available to be used. Make it simple, here you go. Genome, as labeled here, check it out, red arrow, boom. Chromatin, sheet music. All right, so chromatin is to the genome as sheet music is to piano, right? So if you have been given through the lineage of your family and ancestors a piano, the piano doesn't really change much over time. Now, people that know a lot about music knows that wood ages and so on and so forth, but by and large, that genome doesn't really change much. Now, granted, if it's been damaged in shipping, then yeah, maybe there's some troubles there. But by and large, the piano doesn't really change. Same thing with your genome. The genetic profile that you inherited has been combined and recombined, but it hasn't changed a lot over the last 10,000 years. It stays pretty consistent. However, generational changes happen very quickly because the sheet music, what you express, which keys you use, and in what patterns you use them, determine what your body expresses. So when we look at this, if we say this is the warehouse, the reference, the library, all notes are possible on here within the scale that's provided, right? Like you probably don't have genes in you to build wings and horns and a tail, well, maybe a tail, but you only have a certain limited number of genetics and they're sort of pre-built in. But if we say that this is the library and then this over here is the recipe, we could say that notes are the building blocks of music and proteins are the building blocks of your existence, your life, right? So you live sort of musically. And we have a pretty good correlation. So the proteins are made up of amino acids, and amino acids are sequenced in a very specific way and expressed in different patterns, just the same way that notes and music are. So it's actually a really good analogy, if I say so myself. I was actually really happy. I was like, thank goodness something that's easy. So when we're talking about allergies and autoimmune disease, we have a lot of protein conversations. If you've watched the previous two videos, part 1 and part 2, we talked a lot about proteins and protein recognition and protein synthesis and protein triggers and protein, which is why it's super important that when you eat food, you digest it properly. Because if you don't, you're going to end up with protein fragments, and that's going to confuse the whole situation. All right, so moving on. 2014 study out of Australia concluded there was preliminary evidence of pre-birth programming of food allergies. So is it something you need to watch out for? Yes, absolutely. Well, how do you watch out for it? What do you look for? Let's look. There have been no clinical trials on that theory, though, as randomizing women into healthy and unhealthy diets would be unethical. All right, let's take a pause. This is scientific design. Let's talk about applications for life. It is unethical to make pregnant women eat unhealthy. Why? Because we know that it causes damage. We know that it causes damage. We don't know what kind of damage it causes, and that's what the study would be about, right? But we know that it's unethical to make pregnant women eat unhealthy. So, therefore, if you are pregnant or considering becoming pregnant or having a hard time becoming pregnant, then this is a conversation that we should have about what a healthy diet looks like. It's very important. Okay, how to get an allergy or autoimmune disease. This is how you create it, right here. If you're a fetus and your mother has exposure to antibiotics, antacids, environmental toxins, some viruses, if she expresses malnutrition or a narrow food selection, two different things, not enough nutrients, not a broad enough diversity of nutrients, poor health, chronic inflammation, chronic stress response, cigarette smoking, preterm birth, cesarean delivery, and being born in the autumn. Well, I guess technically you'd be born in the autumn. But this is how fetus can have a trigger for allergy. So look at this list. How many women have nausea, morning sickness, and what do they take? They typically take antacids. Antacids stop the digestive process. If you don't digest well, You don't absorb the nutrients. What does that lead to? Malnutrition. What happens if you have narrow food selection? Malnutrition by diversity. What happens if you have malnutrition? Develops poor health. Why? Because of chronic inflammation. All of this is not a separate list of different things. If you don't have enough nutrition, then what builds up in the body? Toxins. What kind of toxins? All the toxins all the time, depending on what nutrients you lack. And what happens if somebody is malnourished and they don't have the right chemistry to make their brain function properly as an organ? They can end up with chronic stress. Is that the only way? Is that the only way they can have chronic stress? No. They could have a lifestyle. They could have other factors. They could have some PTSD. But these are all things that predispose. Remember, it's 1 in 13 children that have allergies. So we can see that in our modern lifestyle, a lot of these factors play in, especially with the rampant use of antibiotics. Matter of fact, this morning I was reading an article where they're talking about a new type of bacteria that was recently discovered that helps to reduce inflammation and obesity. And it is very sensitive to antibiotics. So if a child has antibiotics early on in life, or if the mother takes antibiotics while she's pregnant, it changes the biome, it changes the environment. And those are one of the things that make a bunch of the nutrients for yourself. All right, so babies, pre-birth, have these susceptibilities. How not to. This is what you do to make sure that if you're pregnant or looking to become pregnant, you want your child to have the best possibility to avoid developing allergies. Here you go. Maternal diet that is nutritious. We're going to go right here. Nutritious, that is varied. You have to have good nutrient-dense food. You have a broad, wide variety of foods with healthy fats. A lot of ladies that I've talked to want to avoid fats because they already feel like they're going to get huge when they're pregnant. And really what it comes down to is making sure that you have healthy fats in your diet. That makes it so that your body has enough energy. It also, fats build brain tissue. That's super important too. Okay. They also help to regulate the immune system. Maternal digestion that is complete. If you have incomplete digestion, remember, if you have an antacid and you don't have enough acid to digest your food, then you're going to end up with incomplete digestion. Now, here's one of the things that a lot of people fall prey to. It's a fallacy. They think that if they have reflux, they have too much acid. And it's usually the opposite. They usually have too little acid. There's not enough acid, so your body can't break down your food chemically, so it tries to break it down mechanically. So your stomach squeezes and squeezes and squeezes. You get regurgitation. You don't have too much acid. You have acid in the wrong place because you didn't have enough acid to start with. So digestion is super important. I'm going to keep touching on that. And there's a lot of solutions for that. So anything that we bring up here, there's ways that we can coach and guide you through it. By all means, feel free to ask. Okay, so inflammatory status. What causes inflammation? Reactive oxygen species or pro-oxidants or inflammatory chemicals. What fixes that? Antioxidants. You have to have, there's 5 categories. You have to make sure you cover all 5. Curcumin is great, it covers 1. Resveratrol is great, it covers 1. There's other things that you put together in a group can cover all 5. All right, so let's go on to some of the other things. Larger families. Interestingly enough, in that study they showed that larger family size actually helped to reduce allergies and autoimmune disease. Healthy in utero growth. So obviously if there's any complications, if the child isn't growing well in utero, they're not going to be as strong as robust and they're more likely to have allergies. Okay, full-term gestation. Vaginal delivery. That's where the transference of the microbiome of the mother is given to the child. That's why antibiotic use in the mother causes issues with the fetus because it alters her gut and her flora, and then she doesn't have the right stuff to give to the child to then pass along. Okay, breastfeeding. Breastfeeding allows the mother's immune system to prepare proteins to be sent through the breast milk to the child to then give them the right immune system in their gut. And if they don't get that, then they're kind of working on their own. And a baby's immune system doesn't really develop in the first 4 to 8 months of their life. They're very, very heavily dependent on breastfeeding. And then of course, if there are any epigenetic factors, we can check and correct for those. Obviously, for the developing fetus, it's important to check the mother. Once the child is born, we can check them as well. And then again, we can use the breast milk as a delivery system for those nutrients. All right, Maternal dietary components such as monounsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids and fiber were positively associated with immune factors. What does that mean? So these fatty acids, they regulate metabolism. The fiber feeds your bacteria, your good gut bugs, your probiotic, your biome. Fiber feeds those. So if mama is taken care of because she has good dietary components, it helps with good immune factors for her and the child. Okay. Mothers confer natural passive immunization to their infants through transplacental pathway during gestation period. So when does the mother give the child her immune system? Boom, gestation. While the baby's still on the inside, her immune system goes passively through the transplacental, basically through the placenta to the child during gestation. So when is it important to have these components? The whole time, probably even before. Pre-fertility, during fertility, post-delivery, postpartum. Okay. A pregnant woman's diet consists of many products such as fruits and vegetables, some other things, and various commercially available dietary supplements which contain high number of biological active plant-derived compounds. So this is talking about what you need to have for dietary components. So we know fats, fiber, and then biologically active plant-derived compounds. That's basically why plant-based diets are super important. Not to say that you don't need proteins and that animal proteins are bad, because jury's still out on that one. I think that a well-balanced diet, but one of the issues that we have is people that have a narrow food selection eat the same thing and they're not getting the variety of foods that they need. And then there's a whole bunch of conversations around agriculture and what the quality of soil is and how the farming and everything goes. So what actually gets delivered to you, which I think this is really cool, because here's the thing. There are some places you cannot get fresh food. Everything either comes canned or frozen. And all of the processing has a toll on the food that you get. So what we can see is if fruits and vegetables have these biologically active plant-derived compounds extracted from them properly and preserved, they can be delivered in a supplement, in a dietary supplement, in a supplementary form, and it still helps. I have a fun story about that. If you ever want me to tell it to you, you should just reach out. I will tell you because it's fantastic. It resulted in quite a surprise. Okay, these compounds play a beneficial role in women's health and the development of fetus health. So if you have a wide and varied diet or proper supplementation and you get the biologically active compounds that you need that come from plants, these compounds play a beneficial role in the development of fetal health. So woman's health and fetus health. If you are pregnant and you don't feel healthy, it's taking a toll on you, and the way that works is the mother sort of buffers against the child, but it's actually been shown that if a mother gets injured during her gestation period, the child, the unborn fetus can donate stem cells to the mother to then repair her. It's a mutual relationship. However, if your health is not as strong and robust as you'd like it to be, you owe it to yourself and your baby to do the best you can, and there's ways that we can intervene and help you out with that. Which is interesting. The reason, okay, I'm going to go back to this because this is one of those things that's on my mind. All right, so it says plant-derived. Do you know when these develop? So when we're talking about the spectrum of nutrition, there is minerals that come from the earth, like iron and cobalt and calcium. Those are things that exist, right? And then there's vitamins that are made by plants and animals. And then there are phytonutrients. That's the next level up. Boom, 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 right? Phytonutrients that are made only by plants, and they're made during the last little while of vine ripening, or the ripening portion, while they're preparing these compounds to protect their seeds and the continuation of the lineage of that plant against the harshness of the world around it. Because remember, plants can't like go inside if it's bad weather. They just have to stay there, or if they can't move if something's trying to eat them. So they have to create all these compounds to then protect themselves from external pernicious influences, from the damage in the world around them. So those are made by plants to prepare for the continuation of the species, and it happens towards the end of their life cycle. So if a food is picked before it's ripe, you're not going to have those there. So if you're eating tomatoes, in winter, they were grown somewhere else, picked early so they don't rot by the time they get there. They're shipped, and then they're made to look ripe even though it's empty. There's nothing really in there. Or there's not nearly as much. And some of those plants don't develop these compounds until much later on in their maturation process. So I've had people that have a pristine diet and they are still malnourished because their vegetables that they're eating aren't getting. So fresh is always better. Fresh, locally grown, in season, fantastic. Barring that, supplements are available. Okay, moving right along. While the mother can't always control the way her baby is delivered, remember we talked vaginal birth versus cesarean, exclusive or supplemental breastfeeding may be helpful in reducing the rate of onset and the overall burden of allergies. So rate of onset is how quickly it starts, and overall burden is the total bigness of the damage that happens with the allergies. So some kids are mildly allergic, some kids are severely allergic, and that can be moderated and reduced significantly by some breastfeeding or only breastfeeding. That's what this says here. Fantastic. So, and that, of course, all breast milk is not all breast milk, right? Like the healthier the mom is, the better the breast milk is. Okay. Oh, babies, they're so cute. All right, moving right along. Next stage. Boom. The early years. The first known ingestion of foods often causes allergic reactions. We have to stop and ask the question. If they've never been exposed to it, how does their body know to attack it? Interesting question, right? These are all the things that can cause an allergic reaction or an autoimmune disease. And I highlighted, so each of these are true for all people of all ages. But in early years, what we see that's the most impactful are toxins. Toxins affect children more so than adults because their immune system isn't great. Because their body is still growing really fast, they have a high rate of metabolism. So at that point, if they have any kind of cellular damage, it is magnified through their growth cycle. Okay. So plastics, molds, lipopolysaccharides, those are bacterial and fungal-driven compounds that just cause irritation, inflammation. That's how they induce arthritis in lab animals to test to see if something helps with arthritic joints. Metals, heavy metals, these come from all different sources. Air, water, soil, pollutants. Yes, we have caused a lot of pollution in our environment, so it's something you have to mitigate. And I hope that this brings to the forefront of your mind that there are a lot of things that you need to protect against, not that there's an overwhelming amount of things that you should do, nothing about, but something that you can do something about, things that you need to focus on. Because toxic load and nutrient supply really are a balance. So over here on the top, so mineral oil, malnutrition, prolonged eating period. So if you eat all day long, indigestion, electrosmog. We talked about that before, and that basically is electromagnetic waves that interact with people. Your body runs on electricity. I'm going to do a talk on that one too, because every time I bring this up, I get a lot of blank stares. So this is one of those things that I found to be very fascinating, something that I think is really cool, because there are ways that we can solve problems that would not otherwise even be addressed by looking at those. All right, poor sleep, chronic stress, PTSD, and surgeries. Sometimes surgeries are super necessary and they save lives, and I'm very happy about that. However, that's not the end of the story. That's one of the steps along the way. So if children do have surgery, I've worked on kids that were born with some heart defects that absolutely needed surgery, or otherwise they would have died. So I'm really glad that they got them then. But that's not the end of the story. Western medicine is really good at keeping people alive. Then it's kind of our job and the family's job to do the wellness part, to get them to not just be alive, but to thrive and be awesome. So that's why I picked to be this kind of doctor, because that's the stuff that interests me the most. And I'm so glad that we have the other kind of doctors that do the life-saving stuff. Yeah, because it's all necessary. We all exist in a spectrum. I'm definitely on that spectrum. Okay, here we go. Toxicants. These are the early years. Organophosphate pesticides are widely used in agricultural purposes. Recently, a few studies have demonstrated the ability of these chemicals to alter the function of the thyroid gland in human. Now, thyroid gland is one of those that's easily measured. The tests are they're very precise. They give a lot of really good information. So this is an easy gland to test for, and it's also, the symptomatology of it is obvious. But all glands filter blood. So if it's in the blood, it's affecting all the glands all the time. So Just because we're measuring one doesn't mean the other ones are unaffected. It just means they're unmeasured. So it can have a lot of broad sweeping problems. The present work of this research was to investigate the effects of flavonoid extracts. So flavonoids, these are those plant-based compounds, those plant-made compounds. So flavonoid extracts from celery, the lowly celery plant. Interesting study, sidebar by the way. The reason why they picked celery, you might be like, what, celery? Celery has really cool compounds in it that have been shown. It is actually the #2 plant out of all plants studied to extend the maximum human lifespan and to expand the average lifespan. So the first one is white willow bark, which is really interesting. That's where aspirin comes from. But celery has been shown to be very, very, very impactful in extending life cycle. So why? Because it helps with the nemesis, oxidative stress. Oxidative stress basically makes you age faster, which then means you die faster and you suffer the whole time. So, so they checked. And what they checked it against was this pesticide. It's dichlorvos. It's usually just abbreviated DIC. So you'll see that on the next slide here. Or on, yeah, right here. All right, so observations presented lead us to conclude harmful effects of DIC, dichlorvos, exposure during the exposure and the protective roles of flavonoids minimizing these effects. So this study did two things. It proved that if you take, they used a rat model, if you take, because the rat immune system is similar to ours, if you take a rat and you give it dichlorvos, it harms it. There's harmful exposure, harmful effects from exposure. And if you give it celery flavonoids, it protects from the damage of the dichlorvos. So proves two things really, or it demonstrates two things. Okay. Exposures, this is research out there, and so you know, I covered a broad range of topics, and this is one that came up over and over and over, so I wanted to touch on it. We talked about it before, about adjuvants and vaccination, and I think that vaccination is important. I think that it's something that is a crucial part of public health. I also think that the cure shouldn't cause other problems, right? And that's what this study looked at. So this is a study of vaccinated versus unvaccinated. The vaccinated were less likely than the unvaccinated to have been diagnosed with chickenpox and pertussis. So what the vaccine was made to do, it did. Fantastic. However, but they were more likely to have been diagnosed with pneumonia, otitis media, allergies, and NDD. That's neurodevelopmental disorders. Okay, so this says, and remember, we're talking in context of allergies and autoimmunity. If you burden the body enough, it's going to break down. One of the ways that it breaks down is with allergies. So, in the vaccinated versus unvaccinated study, they showed that the vaccines worked, but there was other problems. So those were the other problems that were created. Pneumonia, otitis media, allergies, neurodevelopmental disorders. Why? Because there's stuff in there that the body has to react to. They have to produce an immune response. Otherwise, the body doesn't go after whatever they're treating. And we know that the treatment was successful because they had less diagnosis of the target, which was chickenpox and pertussis, which are both, I mean, pertussis is awful. Chickenpox, people used to get that all the time and it wasn't so much of a big deal. But pertussis, that's nasty, especially for kids. But what's interesting is this is a lung disease and that's typically lung related as well. Anyway, with the pneumonia. Anyway, moving on. So, further depth of the study, they showed the strength and consistency of the findings and the apparent dose-response relationship between vaccination status and several forms of chronic illness, and the significant association between vaccination and all neurodevelopmental delays support the possibility, obviously this should be the front edge of research, I believe, because here's the thing, we're trying to protect our children from having these diseases. Why? Because if they have those diseases, then it causes problems throughout the rest of their life. You know what else causes problems throughout the rest of their life? These other diseases, right? Okay. So the possibility that some aspects of the current vaccination program could be contributing to the risks of child morbidity. Now here's the thing, this language is very specific. It doesn't say this causes that. What they're saying is there's an association. And this was done with children that were homeschooled. So they had less environmental exposures, they had less interaction with their peers. So they were homeschooled, and not to say that homeschool children don't get out and interact, but it's not the same kind of interaction if they were to go to a regular school all the time. So it's a really good population to study. And again, we can't force people into these scientific groups, but what we can do is we can look at see what's already happening and make some observations from there. But there was also studies done with Gulf War syndrome and a bunch of other stuff when we look at the military as well. So there are some conversations that are happening around this, and I think that if we get more information, we're gonna have a better understanding. Okay, so and again, talking about the science, humans invariably exposed to a complex chemical mixture. So mixtures of complex chemicals, estimating health effects of multi-pollutant exposures is of critical concern in environmental epidemiology. This basically says we have complex chemical mixtures that we are exposed to. That's what it can contribute to allergies and autoimmune disease. Why? Because it burdens the immune system. So if that's the case, we have to test it the way that it is exposed. We want to have real life conversations, and that's what environmental epidemiology does. Epidemiology is the spread of any kind of disease. So environmental meaning what happens with the environment that we're living in. All right, however, most health effects studies focus on single agents or consider simple two-way interaction model, in part because we lack the statistical methodology to more realistically capture complexity of mixed exposures. So what we're saying is right now the science can do some things, but it's really hard to point out one specific thing versus another specific thing. And this is one of the limitations of the way that we do science in America. Now in China, which is interesting because American science and Chinese science kind of argue back and forth. I read all of it because I want to know all of it and I want to get some different perspectives. But they argue back and forth because in China, they think that what we do, the way that we do our studies is not ethical because we tell people we're going to treat them and then we don't treat them. That's called placebo. What they do is they take a whole bunch of people, they take a lot more people, like 10,000 people, where we have studies of like 200, 300, maybe 1,000, maybe 1,500. They take 10,000 people and they'll take half of them and treat them. They'll diagnose all of them and say, okay, well, you're going to be on the wait list and you're going to be on the treatment list. And they treat the people on the treatment list and then they compare that to what happened to the people on the wait list. What that says is there is an effect of this treatment. We don't know if it comes from placebo. We don't know if it comes from doctor-patient interaction. We don't know if it comes from other environmental factors. We don't know. But we do know that if we do this process, these are the results. And if we don't do the process, then these are the results, right? In America, we don't like that because there's too many variables that aren't controlled for. The problem is with controlling the variables too tightly, you make it so you can't get this realistic complexity that is required to understand the overall impact of all of these things all the time. Because one thing might not trigger a reaction, but if you get one compound in context of another compound, you can have 100,000 times effect. It can magnify. Just like with the conversation, we talked about curcumin as an antioxidant. Do you know if you have curcumin in context of piperine, which is an oil that comes from black pepper, if you mix those two together, you get a 10,000-fold increase in the efficacy of curcumin to do what it does in the body. So this is not an uncommon idea. So it's really important that we look at the global picture rather than just bits and pieces, which I'm giving you bits and pieces and trying to put it in context of the global picture. Here we go. Genetic features. Oh, here we go. Genetic features, epigenetic modifications, and alterations of intestinal flora may play pathogenic role in the development of food allergies. So look, genetic feature. Can you do anything about your genes? No, not really. Epigenetic modifications. Can you unmodify modifications? Yes. Epigenetic is changeable. You have to know exactly what you're doing. You have to do it properly, but it's possible. And intestinal flora. What happens to intestinal flora if you eat a terrible diet? All the bad bacteria grow and all the good bacteria die, on average. What happens with antibiotics? Antibiotics kill everything. And then typically some stuff grows back. But again, if you kill if you kill off all the bacteria and then have a bad diet, then you're going to feed the bad bacteria, and then you're going to have intestinal overgrowth and a bunch of other garbage. And that causes chronic inflammation. Because your intestinal bacteria, your flora, they help to maintain the space that they live in. It is a symbiotic relationship. The majority of your brain chemistry is made by your gut bacteria. So if you have bad gut bacteria, it causes inflammation. And we went into great depth on the mechanisms in the last 2 talks. But this is a huge component of it. And the epigenetic piece, intestinal flora, all add up to the contribution to development of a food allergy. So what I want you to understand is this is not a straight one action, one response. It's a law of averages. A bunch of things can happen, your body can deal with it. One more thing happens, and then you hit threshold, and then everything breaks down. Or things can happen gradually over a period of life, or something can happen way early on in life, and it takes a long time for it to develop. I see all of these different examples. This is very complex, and it's very subtle. There's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes. But the better we understand these triggers, the more we can avoid them. Or if we understand there's ways to fix it, we can lean into those. Okay, genetic factors are crucial for the development of food allergies. However, in human evolution, the passing of people on this planet over time, the increase of food allergies occurred is relatively a short period of time. So genetic factors play into it, but all the changes that we've seen cannot be attributed to genetic factors because it's happened too quick. The genome doesn't change that fast. What does change fast? The next two, epigenetics, and intestinal flora. And that's what this says. It cannot be solely the result of a germline genetic mutation. Environmental factors. Okay, hold on, environmental factors. What do we talk about that? Here, if you notice, these two facts build on each other. So humans are invariably exposed to complex chemical mixtures, environmental epidemiology. Let's go here. Environmental factors can also induce epigenetic changes to gene expression. Not the gene itself, but the way that it's expressed. What controls the expression of the gene? Epigenetics. You see? I don't know if you guys are all geeked out about this, but I totally am. Because this tells me that we have a way to get in there with a big old crowbar and move this immovable thing. The thing that a lot of people thought was a death sentence or a life sentence. Sorry, you're just going to have this and it's going to kill you, or you're going to have this for the rest of your life and there's nothing you can do about it. That was the common conversation in allergies and autoimmunities. Like, nope, you can't do that. And we see that over and over and over. And what's really fascinating to me, and I loved this part, when I do these research projects, I will sit for hours and hours and hours. I pulled about 1,200 articles to do this just because I wanted to make sure that all of my facts were based in science, so that way you could reliably look at these and say, yeah, that's true. Okay, and granted, science changes, but what's really fascinating to me is these kind of articles. When you do a research in PubMed, which is the database, you can type in what you're looking for, and it'll give you a timeline of when the research articles have shown up. And what's fascinating to me is prior to like 2000, 2002, there's almost nothing. And then there's this huge surge in new research. So if you're a doctor and you're not keeping up with this, you should. If you're a patient and your doctor isn't keeping up with that, you should find a doctor who is. Okay, sorry, it's a little personal statement on that. Because science changes so fast. Information is way different now than it was 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago. All right. How not to get an allergy. So introducing previously feared foods such as milk, eggs, nuts, and shellfish. Don't be so shellfish. Okay, early peanut introduction at 4 to 11 months was associated with a reduced peanut allergy. There you go. If the body has an early exposure, it's less likely to develop it. Now, why is this important? Because it used to be common knowledge that you had to wait till age 1 or age 2 or even age 3 before you should introduce children to allergenic foods. And it turns out that that's not the case. If you have some kind of introduction of peanut at 4 to 11 months, and remember, it could be the first bite that causes a reaction. So, word of caution there. The less of these factors you have, the more it is perceived safe to introduce these things. But if you introduce them earlier, they're less likely to have reactions. Same thing here with egg, 4 to 6 months, associated with reduced egg allergy. So if you start off early, they're less likely to have an allergy to it. There was a high certainty of evidence that the timing of gluten introduction was not associated with the risk of celiac disease. So egg, yes, peanut, yes, gluten, no difference, according to what the science says. So this is typically the way that it's done. This should be done by an immunologist if you have a suspected immunotherapy. This is just to kind of get you ready to decide if you want to have a conversation with your immunologist, allergist, however you want to go about it. This is typically the process that they'll use. So 1 day, initial dose escalation day. And then they'll just kind of ramp up over a period of time, whatever they feel is right. And then you get to the part over here where you get desensitization and tolerance. And that's typically how they do it. Now, I've seen this done with just food, and I've seen this done with food and nutritional support and epigenetic modifications and all those other things. The more complete the process is, the better off you'll get with your results. Not to say that it guarantees it, because everything's sort of this gray space. All right, neurons. Oh, now we're talking about neurology? Yes, I work neurology into everything because it's super cool and very important. Okay, neurons do possess the capacity to auto-regulate their antioxidant defenses in response to electrical activity. That means if a nerve isn't firing properly, it can't protect itself from the deleterious effects of oxidation, of oxidative stress. They fix themselves by regulating their antioxidant levels with electrical activity. If you have a pinched nerve, it's not as healthy and cannot be as healthy, and it's more susceptible to damage, degradation, and degeneration. Right there. I'm just going to put this slide in every talk I do from now on. Nerves don't have the capacity to function, then they quickly diminish. Okay, microRNAs. What is an RNA? RNA is the complement of DNA. Those are all the proteins that float around in your blood, and they have different things happen. Okay, they orchestrate cellular redox homeostasis, which plays a central role in a multitude of physiological and pathophysiological processes. Basically what this is saying is we use proteins to regulate our body's natural ability to heal itself, and either in health or in disease states. That's physiological is health state, pathophysiology is pathological health, which basically means sickness or disease. Okay, and here's how. Pretty self-explanatory, right? Okay, so if you look up here, all the things we've been talking about, environment, diet, stress, drugs, chemicals, they affect the cell. This little gray arch here, I don't know if you can tell from there, but this is a phospholipid bilayer. That's the cell membrane. So all these things happen outside the cell to then make things happen inside the cell that leads to, wait a second, epigenome. Hey, that's the epigenetic factors. See? So all this stuff on the outside creates reactive oxygen species. Those are oxidative stress. And then that changes the genome, which then comes down here into this fuchsia arrow is altered gene expression. This magenta arrow is changes in protein translation. So basically what happens is you get stressed, it causes cellular damage, your body responds but in a compromised way, it changes the way that your body can respond, it makes it so you can't make the things you need, and eventually modulation of pathophysiologic functions and pathological effects. Basically, if we start at the top, we put in stress, we change the gene, and then we make it so your body can't be as healthy. That's what all this says. So the more stresses and the more different kinds of stress you have, and the less antioxidant you have to buffer that, the more likely it is to affect your epigenome, which then not only makes changes in the moment, it makes changes ongoing. Remember, the epigenetics, if somebody came over and tore up your sheet music, then you can't play the other half of the song. That's what this says. And you can buffer that by reducing stress and increasing antioxidants. Love it. Okay, so adolescent, speaking of damage, the most common thing that happens in adolescence and early adult is damage. This is when people are the most physically active. This is when we see sports, we see different kind of physical exertion training, high school, college, recreational endeavors. Typically, kids of a younger age don't have as much of this. People at this time, because they're working towards achieving a significant result, maybe they're in their prime, so to speak, so they're pushing extra hard. If you have a lot of damage, either by overtraining, this happens a lot with marathon runners, people that do powerlifting, combat sports, football, anybody that has contact sports, even soccer. So girls that get hit in the head with a soccer ball because they're playing soccer, it can cause concussions. It's the number one cause, but that's not exclusively to those areas. It covers a lot of people. But in this age, also, this is typically when people do the most adventurous things, jumping off, doing cliff diving and so on and so forth. I use cliff diving as an example because I worked on a lady who was on vacation in Mexico, was doing cliff diving, jumped off the cliff, hit the water, shattered her tibia in a bunch of places. They had to bolt it all together. And not only did she walk differently after that, but she also developed a bunch of other allergies. Okay, so here's our friend, Mr. Wacky Face, the hammer. That's just to pay homage to one of my instructors who always said, hey, what would happen in your body if I hit you with a hammer? Would you like that? And that was always his go-to, the way to induce damage. He was from the East Coast, so I figured that was just part of his upbringing. And of course, damage cast. Okay, moving on. Unintentional injury accounts for 40% of childhood deaths. That's very sad. 8 million children required medical care for injuries in 2009. That's the most recent updated statistic, resulting in 132,000 hospital admissions. So 8 million children in a year required medical care. That's just the ones that went to the hospital. That's not the ones where they hit the deck and they're like, you're fine, shake it off, rub some dirt on it, you'll be okay. Turns out, on average, children have to report something 12 times before adults will listen to them. If your children tell you that they hurt, you should listen to them. Here's where the most common sources of injury come in, because if you have a bunch of damage, it can eventually lead to allergies and autoimmunity. Fall, contact injury, overexertion. What does that sound like? Anybody play sports? Falls, contact injuries, and overexertion? And that's 33, 23, and 9%. So yeah, the majority of problems happen with things that happen in sports. And here's the thing, I'm not saying you shouldn't play sports. What I'm saying is sports adds a risk. You should counteract that risk by being more specific and precise with your recovery. Most people that mess up the recovery, okay? Because it's fun to play the sport. Doing the behavior around making sure you maintain yourself, not so common. And then, of course, the rest of those there. Moving on. Increased intensity of sports activities combined with a decrease in daily physical activity is making overuse injuries in children more common. This happens because there is a greater and greater demand for academic performance and athletic performance. And though the bar has been set younger and younger and younger for a myriad of different reasons, of which we do not have time to get into today, but I do want to highlight that there is a cultural shift in the pressures placed in children, and it creates these overuse injuries. Now, overuse injuries, are they obvious? Not really. Are they severe? No. Are they acute? No. Do they usually get treated? Not unless they become prohibitive. So they're typically overlooked. They're left to sort of smolder under the surface, and they cause long-standing chronic issues. That's how allergies and autoimmunities develop. Because if it's acute, you take care of it. If it's something that's sort of assumed, and it's maybe not that the children aren't experiencing them, they might not be reporting them because they don't want to be taken out of their sport because it's so much fun to win. Okay. Pain in children during sports should not be considered normal. If your child hurts doing their thing, you need to address that. And there's a couple of different ways to do that. That's what I'm trained in. That's why I point this out. And I tell this to parents, and they look at me like I'm crazy because their coaches are like, no, they're fine. That's totally normal. No, it's not. There's no such thing as a normal symptom. Cut it out. You're predisposing that child to long-term, lifelong damage that probably isn't going to show up for 20 years. Take care of it early. They will perform better, they will be happier, and lifelong, they will have better opportunities. Okay. The main treatment for these injuries is temporary suspension of athletic activities combined with conservative care. In one of my other talks, we talked, actually it was the whiplash conversation because we talked a lot about biomechanics, and then when we get to the part where we talked about treatment, I've laid out in there very specifically the 4 steps that your body wants to heal. This is something that took me a long time to figure out, and I put this together as a guideline for my patients that says, well, what about this? What about this? Because in healthcare, you have thousands of options. Knowing which one to do first to get the most impact is very important. So it goes neurological, because if your nerves aren't working, nothing else matters, right? Then mechanical, which is stretching exercise. Then it goes to chemical. Chemical can run parallel tracks, especially if you're really behind. And then the 4th one is behavioral. Now, this says suspension of athletic activity. That's a behavioral change. That's the least effective. And it might work, and that might be all you need. You might only need a small intervention. But if that's not enough, it's because you started at the wrong end. And then a lot of times anti-inflammatories are given. Well, we know that anti-inflammatories cause problems with tissue regeneration, and they can induce a cycle of reactive inflammatory or allergy or autoimmune, or it can be auto-inflammatory. So conservative care is usually mechanical. So I believe that neurological should be added to this list and should be put first, because when you have proper neurological control, you maintain your body much better, much easier. You have more control. You're less likely to accumulate damage. They've shown that athletes that get adjusted have 30% faster reaction time, and they're less likely to get injured. One of the chiropractors that I studied had, with his system, he was the team chiropractor for the Utah Jazz, and he reduced injuries by league average by over 65% compared to other professional basketball teams that also had doctors on staff. So there's something that he had, and I studied his system, and it's phenomenal. There's things that he had that prevented even more injuries. So, and that's not talked about generally, and I think it should be, because it's awesome, and you need it. Okay, surgery may be performed if conservative treatment fails. Well, wait a minute. Conservative treatment, suspension, surgery. Now, like I said, I think surgery is important. And in all the research we have, it says it shouldn't be first or even second. But it should happen only when it's the last option. And most surgeons I've ever talked to says, yeah, that's true. We should do everything we can to avoid surgery. I have patients that come to see me, they say, hey, I have a good surgeon, and he said that my knee's not quite bad enough to need it replaced. I got a couple of years on it, and I should come back when I need it done. I said, okay, well, that gives me a window to see if we can increase your quality of life and see if we can fix some of the other factors so that you don't have to have surgery so soon. So yeah, we work together as a team to keep people healthy. That's important to know too. All right, tendon overuse injuries and tendinitis are accompanied by catabolic processes and apoptosis of tenocytes. So catabolic process, this means you break down your own tissue. And that was one of the triggers that started the whole allergy autoimmunity. When the body shows up to a damaged area, it looks at everything there. And it gathers all of those things and it sends it through the lymphatic system. The spleen filters and picks out pieces of protein and say, hey, that's a problem, that's a problem, that's a problem. And then it sends that information to the thymus to then program the T cells to go out and find those and attack them. The problem is not every protein there is a bad guy. Your tenocytes aren't bad guys. The proteins involved in that process aren't bad guys. Apoptosis means that those cells weren't broken down correctly and recycled. They were just sort of shattered and they died. And then your immune system has to clean that up, and it looks like a foreign body. So then that's what starts the allergy autoimmune cycle from overuse injuries. Specifically, in this case, they talked about tendons, but it's true for muscle, it's true for ligament, it's true for organ, it's true for blood, it's true for all kinds of other things. This study just works as an example in that area. Okay, resveratrol, one of my favorites, by the way. This is how not to get an allergy autoimmune disease. Resveratrol inhibited interleukin 1 beta and nicotinamide-induced NF-kappa beta activation and P65 acetylation suppresses. Anyway, all of these chemicals mentioned in here, interleukin 1 beta, nicotinamide-induced NF-kappa beta activation, blah, 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 all of that stuff are inflammatory biomarkers that upregulate your inflammation. Resveratrol inhibited it. That's all you need to take away. Resveratrol keeps your inflammation down. Next. Okay, resveratrol also reversed. All right. Inhibited, so it slowed the process, but it also reversed upregulation of gene products that mediate inflammation. There. All right. So resveratrol reversed upregulation of gene products. Remember those mRNAs we talked about earlier? The mRNA and the epigenetic components. So resveratrol works at the gene level, at the epigenome, to bring inflammation down. That's awesome. You need that if you have inflammation. If you're dealing with allergies, autoimmune, I've seen this every day in my clinic, every day, which is so cool that I get to see that because it's not just theory. It's actually put into practice and it works. Okay. The aim of the study was to investigate the regulatory effects of taurine. It's an amino acid. If you digest well, you got plenty of that in your diet. If you don't digest well, who knows? Okay. The effects of taurine on the biochemical parameters for muscle injury by overuse. Keyword, overuse. Now we're not talking about tendons anymore, we're talking about muscle. So they took a bunch of rats, gave them, some of them taurine, some of them not, and then they put them on a treadmill basically to force them to overexercise and overexert. Then they took the quadricep muscle, looked at it under a microscope, which, by the way, looking at tissue under a microscope is the study called histology, which we see here mentioned. Histologic. So basically, they looked at tissue under a microscope. The analysis and evaluation of mitochondrial function oxidative stress, tissue repair, and DNA damage markers. Hold up. All right, so oxidative stress, we get that. The tissue could be inflamed. Tissue repair, that's fish in a barrel, duh, right? We're looking at tissue, we're looking at tissue repair factors. But mitochondrial function, if you damage mitochondria, they produce 98% of your energy. So people that have chronic fatigue have mitochondrial issues. And a whole bunch of other things. People that have chronic diseases. Why? Because disease takes energy. If you don't have enough energy, the disease is going to win. Okay. And then, whoa, DNA damage. That's the genome. That's the piano. Somebody kicked your piano and broke one of the little wheels off the bottom. So they looked for all these things. And taken together, these data suggest that taurine supplementation modulates various cellular remodeling parameters, all of them measured, by the way. It does all of them. For overuse-induced muscle damage, that these positive effects may be related to its antioxidant capacity and rebuilding. So if your muscles have damage from overuse-induced muscle damage, all right, so I worked at a podiatry office for about 5 years, and I loved it. It was fantastic. I got to work with really high-level athletes, dancers, marathoners, triathletes, and these people had a lot of overuse-induced muscle damage. Just like a lot of the power lifters and martial artists that I worked with, you train and train and train to be the best, but it takes a toll. And if you don't pay that toll, it will eventually break you down. Okay, 20 to 40. The next step we're going to cover is what happens to people generally in the 20-year-old to 40-year-old category, and that is stress. Could you have any of these other things? Yes, absolutely. All right, stress. Active stress, acute stress, chronic stress, right? While you can keep up with it, when you can no longer keep up with it. Here we go. I'm going to start up in this corner and work around clockwise. All right. So headaches, frequent infections, tight muscles, muscular twitches, fatigue, skin irritations. By the way, feel free to raise your hand if you have any of these. This is a survey. If you say yes to a couple of these, then maybe this applies to you. All right. So fatigue, skin irritations, breathlessness, worrying. We're in the mind category now. Worrying. Muddled thinking, impaired judgment, nightmares, indecisions, negativity, hasty decisions, behavior. Accident prone, loss of appetite, loss of sex drive, drinking more, probably alcohol, insomnia, restlessness, smoking more. Emotions, apprehension, alienation, apathy, depression, irritability, more fussy, and loss of confidence. This is hormonally driven. Hormones are proteins. Proteins are subject to immune function. Okay. Symptoms of depressed mood and anxiety have been associated with immune dysregulation and atopic disorders. Atopic just means it's in a different place. So, lifetime history of major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder was assessed using the composite international diagnostic inventory. So there's this diagnostic inventory that is used across the world, and it's pretty common, and it's really well recognized. So this is a high quality study. They looked at all these different things, and they confirm the association between major depressive episodes and panic disorders and seasonal allergies that extends this relationship to generalized anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. Pretty fascinating. So if you have some of these stress-related components, it does increase seasonal allergies. Why? Because of this sweet little gem right here, the HPA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This exists in the body, and this is the neuroendocrine network, one of them, that responds to psychological stress. So chronic psychological stress affects the way that your brain, affects your endocrine system, which is your hormone system, and that changes your immune system. The skin has its own HPA axis, similar to the central one. So not only do you have one in your whole body, but you have one in the skin. See where we're going with this? Here's the skin. Allergens, scratching, bacteria. It creates this inflammation in the skin, which uses all these inflammatory components here, IL-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, IL-18, substance P. So all of these components are inflammatory, and they're all signaling chemicals to your brain and your body that something's going on. You have one in your skin, you have one in your body. So I've worked on people that have had so much stress that their skin literally looked like they were burned. And by fixing that, we fixed all of it. It was fantastic. So that's a real problem. And what's really interesting is, of the people I've worked on, now take into consideration the people that usually show up here asking for this haven't had results from the other professionals that they've seen. So that being said, I'm not here to replace everybody that's doing great work. I'm here to fill in the gaps where that work doesn't fix everybody, right? Because science is designed, especially Western medicine, is designed to take care of people by and large. But there are some people that don't fit the standard and they come to me. So when we fix them. But this is way more complex, way more complicated. This is all exception processing. All right, so here's the schematic of how that works. A couple of things that are important to look at here. People might have heard of mast cell activation, which is sort of how chronic inflammation turns into an autoimmune disease, which then leads to histamine, skin barrier impairment, and then neurogenic inflammation. So neurogenic inflammation is inflammation that is caused by neurology. So that's an important piece because that's kind of outside of the box. Most doctors don't look at those connections. That increases substance P, and then that increases all these other things over here. So moving right along. Chronic T helper cells, the predominant cytokine profile acts as a negative feedback loop to blunt the HPA axis in response in atopic dermatitis. So we talked about these T cells before. So if they are chronically activated, it works to blunt the function of the HPA axis. So again, another way that these cells interact. Insomnia is highly prevalent in asthmatics. However, a few studies have investigated insomnia symptoms in asthma development. Turns out that if you don't sleep, if you have insomnia, your risk of developing asthma is 3 times higher. Essential circadian clock tunes the innate circadian physiology rhythms to a 24-hour light-dark cycle, okay? So this is part of how sleep cycle affects your body's cleanup rhythms, and it's based off of light and dark. Melatonin sends the message to the clock that changes sleep and wake cycles, blood pressure, and metabolism. This is how it helps to reset your body. So melatonin interacts with this cycle to fix it, especially if it's been broken down. Clinical meaningful effects of melatonin treatment have demonstrated placebo-controlled trials in humans. So super rigorous science shows that melatonin absolutely does affect your sleep cycles. So if you don't sleep well, if you have too much stress, if it's messing up your body's inflammatory cascades, melatonin can help. Now we're going to go through the next part. Remember, everything that we've talked about applies to everything moving forward. So we're just going to kind of clean up the last little bit here. So what happens over 40? Exhaustion. As time builds up on people, they tend to have breakdowns that accumulate. If you don't deal with it early, it shows up late. All right, so exhaustion. The decline of immunocompetence with age is accompanied by the increased incidence of autoimmune disease. So as people get older, their immune system works less, but it also, the work that it does is actually harmful to itself. The aging immune system, or immunosenescence, is characterized by a decline of both T and B cells, which the ones are supposed to be cleanup cells, but paradoxically, meaning it doesn't make sense, the presence of low-grade chronic inflammation. We know that allergies and autoimmunity are low-grade chronic conditions, and that happens with age, so we know that this is a factor. Emerging evidence suggests a key role for epigenetics in human pathologies, including inflammatory and neoplastic disorders. Inflammatory, this is when your body goes too much with the immune system. Neoplastic, that's cancer. That's when your immune system doesn't do what it's supposed to. So either way, we see that there are epigenetic factors. If you want to get these tested, we can do that here in the office. Okay, closing thoughts. First off, thank you. Structure and function is quality of life. You can't look at one part of this puzzle and say that it will fix both parts because you basically are graded by the lowest performance. So structure is chemistry, function is neurology. If you want your quality of life to be great, you have to address both. You have to address both. Okay, input times process equals output or product. So a lot of times people look at, I'm doing all these things, I'm taking all this stuff. It's not giving me the result I want. It's not giving me the product that I want. Because sometimes your body doesn't process it right. Because those allergies and autoimmunities can show up throughout the body. That's why it's important to address all of it. You can't just do input, you have to do process as well. There is a greatness that exists in all people that expresses itself when suffering is at a minimum. Why do I do this? Why do I spend so much time preparing these and delivering them? Because I believe that everybody deserves the chance to express the greatness of themselves, and we do that through minimizing suffering. The body is an environment with finite resources. You are not immortal, and there is a finite number of adaptations you can make. Final closing thought. Nowhere else does the law of supply and demand show a greater penalty for ignorance than in biological economy. If you do not pay attention to what you're asking of your body and what you're giving it, you will ultimately pay a penalty. If you want to know how to get more of this, there you go. Thank you very much for your time and attention. We'll see you in the next one.